everyone. And for those of you who can't hear, we invite you back. Oh, yeah, now it's gotten really quiet. I'm Heather Farrell. I'm the curator and director of exhibitions at BCA, and I am thrilled to be here today to introduce our next three artist and brilliant thinker presenters. And for those of you who haven't had an opportunity yet to see the amazing exhibition that Chris has guest curated for us, co-created, hopefully you can join us later for the reception tonight following the symposium and see this work in person, and hopefully you'll learn a lot more about it in depth in the next hour. And so just a little bit on format, we have three wonderful artist presenters here, and they have 20 minutes, and then we'd like to save the questions to the end to allow everyone a chance to present for what they had planned. All right, so with that, if you haven't already checked out your wonderful program guide here, I'd love to say that we have extended bios, and so that we can get to the artist presentations, I would just like to say our order of presentations is first Jane Addams, then Minne Atairu, and then Lapo Frati. And they'll each do a brief intro of who they are, but most importantly, they are all wonderful exhibition artists as part of Co-Created. And with that, I'd love to welcome Jane up and give her a hand.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jane Addams. I'm a Ph.D. student at Northeastern University studying computer science, specifically data visualization. But I actually lived here in Vermont for 10 years before I left to return to my hometown of Boston. And when I was here, I was studying first graphic design at Champlain College, and then did a Master's of Fine Arts in Emergent Media. And that was really where I started to see the incredible value of the intersection of arts and technology. And I am always so delighted to talk to people who self-describe as not a computer person or not a math person, because I really think that we're at a critical juncture right now in technological advancement where we really need artists to be thinking about these tools, to be advocating for the ethical use of these tools, and also communicating these tools to the public. So I'm endlessly excited to be talking to people all day today about creative AI, and I wanted to share a little bit of the background behind my sculpture, which is on display now at Burlington City Arts, called Latent Prism. So during the pandemic, I was making kind of a pivot in my art practice because, as Heather knows, prior to everything being shut down in 2019 and into the beginning of 2020, I was really starting in my art practice to move into like large-scale sculptural work. I had built a aquaponic diorama, which was like a fish tank on the bottom of a sculpture and then a dollhouse on the top of the sculpture. And it was a very large work. It required a lot of studio space, a lot of woodworking. It was quite an adventure installing it at the gallery. And I really thought that that was where my art practice was going to go, was into the realm of large-scale installation work. And then the pandemic happened, and generators shut down, and we were all working from home, and I had this tiny little apartment where I was still trying to create these large-scale works. And I really, it forced me to pivot and think about the mediums that I was using and the scale that I was working at, and really start to look around in different directions that, I hadn't looked before. And so I had seen some artist talks about the idea of artificial intelligence and people developing their own models. And note that this was in 2020, so this was kind of before we really saw a lot of the big text-to-image models that have kind of been taking the news and the world by storm recently, including DALL-E, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion. So this was kind of all pre that, and it was more, I saw a very small handful of artists who are working with what we call generative adversarial networks to create their own generative models for a specific specific kind of visual output. So they weren't these kinds of models where you could put anything into it and get anything out, that you could get an avocado chair because it had seen avocados and chairs. These were really models that were trained on a very small subset of data that had commonalities. And so this was one of the first models that I trained. You'll see on the right-hand side an output video, and then on the left-hand side some of the input images. So what we're looking at here are actually hydrological survey images from the European Digital Archive of Soil Maps. It's a really incredible resource, incredibly just wonderful to scroll through and like look at these artifacts, because they were all made by hand. A lot of them are from like the era in the 1950s to the 1980s, and they show the soil composite data. They show hydrological changes over time. You can really start to understand the geography of a region, and how things like erosion and plate tectonics and all kinds of things impact what happens underneath your feet. And so I was just so delighted, not only by the incredible evidence of community collection and education that went into the collection of these images, but also just from an artist perspective, like the color palettes are so delightful. Including in some of these, you'll actually see their like multicolor processes where they're silk screening and then overlaying colors. So in order to get green, they're actually silk screening a yellow sheet and then a blue sheet. And so something that I found when I was curating data for my own models is that I really needed to find data that was fun to look at, because you look at a lot of data, like thousands and thousands of images. And of course it was pandemic times, and so what else are you going to do all day but listen to podcasts and like collect pictures of pretty maps? I mean, it was not a bad place to be, right? So this was one of the first models that I trained. So the way that a generative adversarial network works, and I'm always struggling with whether or not I should anthropomorphize this conversation, because on one hand, I do think it's really important that we recognize that AI is really humans building things, and they are statistical machines. But I also think that there's a useful metaphor here when we talk about generative adversarial networks, to think about them almost as two neural networks in conversation with one another. So here what we're seeing is a generator network and a discriminator network. So the generator is basically producing images, originally starting with just noise, just random pixels. And the discriminator is seeing what the generator has created, and it's also seeing real samples. So it's seeing that real training data, in this case, the maps from the European Digital Archive of Soil Maps. And the discriminator is looking at the generated fake samples, and it's looking at the real samples, and it's deciding, is this real or is this fake? And it does that back and forth with the generator for a while. So the discriminator will either say, I know that's fake, and here's how I know that's fake, and the generator is penalized and goes back to the drawing board, or it's fooled. And so what basically happens is, over time, both neural networks are getting better at their jobs. The generator is getting better at generating images, and the discriminator is getting better at judging those images. And the two neural networks are sort of having this back and forth on a supercomputer for a long period of time, until they reach a point where it becomes very difficult to distinguish the generated fake samples from the original real samples. And that's how we produce images using generative adversarial networks that look convincing. Sometimes. You may have seen that some of these models don't do very well with hands. GANs in general are terrible at counting, so they don't know how many fingers. They just know, that looks hand-like, and I've seen a bunch of hands, and who am I to know that 6 fingers is, not, it's relatively anomalous in the real world. So I really, as I was working on this process, really finding that it was important to me to think about which data I was using, both from a provenance perspective, like where does that data come from, who owns that data, what access is important to consider with that data, and then also because I was doing a lot of this curation manually, really making sure that it was a visual subject that I was interested in. So what we see here on the left, again, is training data. These are from a royalty-free stock photo website called Pexels. And on the right is a generated video created of landscapes from this model. And so you can see it kind of cycling between desert and forest and mountains. And actually, this model I trained with a friend of mine at the University of Vermont, Alexa Woodward, who is a musician who also was having this kind of existential crisis during the pandemic and created this really beautiful album called Voyager, which I highly recommend you check out. And the two of us together collaborated on a video, basically like a music video album. And so the whole thing is available online, and each video is a different custom StyleGAN model, StyleGAN being a specific kind of generative adversarial network. And what we did together is we talked through basically the subject matter of the songs and also just the vibe that we wanted. And so for this model in particular, it's the last song on the album. It's called Waiting on You, and it's about the musician having grown up in a very religious context and then kind of reaching adulthood and looking around, kind of waiting on what some sign from the heavens that somebody was up there paying attention. And so actually we went through a bunch of different iterations first, where we were looking at church imagery and church architecture, and it just wasn't feeling right with her. So we trained a bunch of different models on different data sets. And finally, we went back to the drawing board, and she was like, no, I think what I really want actually is scenes of nature, because that's where I feel the most spiritually connected. And originally, me growing up in New England, I collected a whole bunch of forest photos because that is nature to me. But Alexa had grown up in Utah before having moved to Vermont. And so she really wanted the dynamism of these big open spaces that you get out in drier places than here, combined with the images that you see that are of forests and reminiscent of New England. So this was a really fun project, and I felt like it kind of got to the it almost looks like a landscape that's changing on a geologic scale, like the kind of video that you would like to see if you did a time lapse of millions of years on Earth. So thinking about these two models, I had an idea for a third model, which was aerial photographs. So drone photographs of nature. So sort of combining this like top-down view, like we had with the maps, but then also landscapes and changing landscapes over time. And I was also really excited by the idea of thinking about geologic timescales and thinking about ice ages and climate change and the cyclic nature of the Earth. Maybe in a little bit of a hope too that like things might return to normal at some point. So this was the model that I generated. I think this GIF is relatively slow moving. I've been experimenting a lot with like the speed at which things change. And so you can see the animated video on the left, and then some pictures on the right showing some of the images that came out of the model. And what was really interesting to me was, first of all, places where it glitched, like places where it created road structures that would never normally exist, or dead ends. But then also, like, there were a lot of images where it looked kind of like something had been submerged, like there was this ghostly civilization that had been left behind. And so I really, I was so delighted by these images, and also it made me think a lot about themes of climate change and the conversations that we've been having too about the, carbon footprint of training these models. the carbon footprint of training a single style GAN model is maybe not as significant as some of these really large scale language models that are able to reference a whole bunch of information. But then things actually did start to like come back to normal a little bit. Like we started re-entering physical spaces, and I'd been doing all of this digital work, and I was like, oh crap! Now how do I actually bring the things that I've been doing in digital space back into physical spaces? And so I started experimenting. This is a demonstration where I took a model that this was actually the interstitial model from that music video where I had only trained on forests, and I took this video that I had created from that model and placed it into a 3D environment in Blender. So this was, a 3D room from like a video game type setup, put it behind the window, and then projection mapped it onto my wall. And so that's what you're seeing there with my hand waving in front of it is actually, this is a projection on a wall. But I kind of wanted to know, like, what would it feel like to be living in a room or to be living in a world where the, environment outside is ever so slowly changing around you, maybe as kind of a commentary on what was happening outside my own window. Another thing that I started thinking about was communication and how to talk to people about these models. And one thing that I keep revisiting is the idea of high dimensionality. So we can think about things in 2 dimensions, we can think about things in 3 dimensions, but basically what AI models are doing is they're thinking about things in extremely high dimensional spaces. And all of a sudden kind of our existing paradigms for how we talk about representations using spatial models kind of start to break down when we start adding a 4th and a 5th and a 512th dimension. So I kind of wanted to like simplify down and talk about some of these concepts in an accessible way. And so this was a very early prototype of a latent cube that I had created in Blender, where I took the output from one of those models of forests and mountainsides and desert, and was creating basically a tour through the latent representation of the data using a 3-dimensional representation. So it's almost like you're bouncing around in space and being able to kind of explore slices of the representation of the world that this model has learned. So then another idea that I had was encoding time along the z-axis. So as I showed before, I have these animations that are basically going from some random point in high dimensional space to another random point in high dimensional space. And basically what we're seeing in videos is a linear interpolation from one point to another. And so you can think about those almost instead of an animation as a stack of images where you're actually just taking all of the frames from the video and putting them on top of each other. So I did a whole bunch of prototypes. These are potted plants that I actually, I'm very curious to hear people's opinions on this because I did scrape these from the likes of Home Depot and Lowe's and Amazon in order to create my artwork. So this is a StyleGAN model that was trained on potted plants, and I printed out all of these plants, and then using FedEx Kinkos, by the way, can print transparency film, and it's so exciting because you can do so much with it. And so that's what these are is actually printed transparency film. And so I set to work building larger and larger prototypes, and these were some of my processes. You can see that there's a lot of adhesives in the background because actually what I found was it's very challenging to work with adhesives and transparency and ink all at the same time. So some things stuck together really well but took the ink off, and some things didn't take the ink off but didn't stick together really well either. So there was a lot kind of left on the cutting room floor there. But here was some more images of the process. I was trying to figure out like what's the optimal stacking and opacity for each of these images. Lots and lots of sanding. So these are layers of heavy lucite. and I really wanted to get the edges just crystal clear. But this was the end result, was the sculpture that you'll see. And then I also was thinking about provenance and these conversations about citations and what belongs in the artist's credits. And so here is the API for Pexels, which was that stock photo website that I mentioned. So I actually had all of the metadata for all of the 17,000 images that I had used to train this aerial photograph model. So I printed them all out on architectural drafting paper and I cut them up, and then I used my drill to roll it all up into a scroll because rolling by hand was giving me carpal tunnel. So, so this is my drill rolling up that scroll. And so when you go into the gallery, it's not piled up at the bottom like this. BCA had a much better idea, which was to hang it by the scroll on the wall. And so along with my name, you'll also see the name of all of the photographers whose images were included in this model.
Adjust it. Okay. So my name is Minne. I'm also one of the artists in the show. So I'm an interdisciplinary artist. I'm also a doctoral student at Columbia University. I am in the art and art education program. And I like to think I moonlight as an artist, but I find that it's become more of a full-time job than it is a side gig. So I'm also a full-time artist. And so much of my work and my artistic practice, it's research-based. This means I often will start with a question, which I then attempt to answer by probing at the question, and not in absolute terms, but I often think of my works as an exercise in imagination. And I like to conduct these imaginations with generative AI. So today, I will be talking about a project that's currently on view at BCA. I'm just wondering if anyone has seen my piece or if you remember what I have in view. It's probably like a photograph of terracotta objects that are framed in a white frame. So the tradition that my work builds on a tradition known as the Benin Bronzes. It's a method of making from the place known as Benin. That's where I come from. And if you're unaware of where Benin is located in the southernmost parts of Nigeria. And Nigeria on the world map is in the West African coast. So Benin is in Nigeria, Nigeria is in the West African coast. So on the screen, I have an image of what is known as a Benin bronze. A lot of museums and art historians refer to these objects as Benin bronzes. They were stolen from Nigeria in 1897, and we kind of like want to hold on to that date because it's important to my work. So they were stolen in 1897 by the British colonial government because, well, we refused to do trade with them on their own terms. So in terms of my research question, this is what my research question, and I mentioned it earlier, because my work is really based on research questions. I was very interested in what followed that colonial invasion where these objects were stolen and looted from Nigeria. So I was particularly interested in a period that I described as having minimal to no artistic production, and this for a lot of reasons, which I will come to during my presentation. So here on the screen, I just wanted to highlight what bronze casting looks like in Benin. It's still in this way today. It's not inside of studios, but it's a practice that exists outdoors, and it's done through a process known as lost wax casting. So on the screen, you can see a bronze caster. He's kind of like molding the wax and creating the mold for that. Ideally, they would pour like the bronze inside. So instead of doing like an art historical kind of narrative, I wanted us to just go through what the process of art making is, and then we'll figure out from there as researchers. I'm inviting all of us to join me on this research, right? As researchers, we'll figure out why I saw this artistic decline and decided to pursue it. So traditionally in Benin, in pre-colonial times, you would have the king who was known as the Alba. And the Alba was at the head, he was basically the sole commissioner of the arts. So as an artist in Benin Kingdom, you could not make, especially with items that were foreign to the land. So like bronze as a material is not native to Benin. It was an import. So we have it here. The king imports bronze. He was doing trade with the Portuguese who would import bronze to Benin Kingdom, and he would store it within his palace. So if you were like me and you're not from the royal family, you were just like an everyday person, you were a farmer, you couldn't have access to bronze, which means ideally you wouldn't have a bronze item in your home, except the king gave you permission to produce it. So the king typically would commission this work, and most of them were for him in his palace. If you did something that he felt was good and great and he wanted to gift you something, he would probably say, okay, go to my bronze casters and they'll produce something for you. But in most cases, it's usually the royal family. So, and from this tradition, right, this kind of his being the sole commissioner of the arts led him to, commission all these works that commemorated his ancestors. And so I like to highlight this because very often when people think of the Benin Bronzes, there's this idea that it belongs to everyone in Benin, but it's not. These are objects that belong to the royal family, not everyone in Benin. And so I as an artist, even though I investigate Benin Bronzes, it's traditionally not something that my ancestors had in their homes. And so this for me would be the bronze casting tradition, and at the bottom of this is the bronze casters, who the king basically, he sponsored their lifestyle. He provided the quarters where they live. It was connected to his home where he had easy access to them. And so another example on the screen, we have an image. This is the earliest known image of an altar in Benin, and I'm just highlighting this here to show how these objects were used. A lot of them were for religious and cultural purposes, some were for ceremonial purposes, and others served as functional pieces, right? Because in the collection we have objects that are spoons, keys, fabrics, materials, furniture, but this is the first known altar. And if you pay attention to the top section of the photo, it says Juju Altar, King's Compound, Benin City, May 1891. So let's talk about how the objects were stolen. So it's 1897, during the industrial era, and palm oil, right, is the resource. Because we know, one thing we know about colonialism is that it was purely about resource extraction from communities. And so what was the resource in my community that led to this colonization? It was palm oil. So palm oil during the industrial era was in high demand in Europe for soap making, candle making, machine lubrication. And on the screen I have an image from Sunlight Soap Factory, which is one of the earliest soap making brands in Europe to transition from using animal fat to palm oil products. This is another image also taken in 1897 of the Lever Brothers port facility that was also one thing in these barrels, not everything in the barrel, it's just some of the barrels probably contain palm oil, which was imported the same year that Benin was invaded. So I don't know if the palm oil was exactly extracted from Benin or if it was from a lot of communities, but we know that this picture, to me, it's relevant as a researcher because it says a lot. And so, due to the fact that our king refused to do trade on the British terms, and the term was that we would sort of cede, because our king was a monarch and he would control trade, he would open and close the markets when and whenever he pleases. It was not very good to do trade with us at the time because we had a lot of ceremonies, which if British traders sailed all the way for Britain to do trade with us, but Benin was closed, and that was just terrible for business, right? So the British colonial government invaded Benin, and on the screen I have images of this invasion. During this invasion, they stole every single thing they could find that they could associate with the monarchy. So on the screen you can see, if you pay attention to the foreground, you can see some objects. You'll see tusks, you'll see bronze object, there's a little sort of leopard there, figures, all around them. There are a lot of images. If you Google, you'll find them. And so after these cultural objects were stolen, they were shipped off to England, where they were sold to a lot of your favorite museums. So we have the Met. I know Fleming Museum has one. Benin Bronzes, 160 museums worldwide have at least one Benin Bronze. So if the museum has an African art collection or some kind of world collection, it probably does have one Benin Bronze. And it could be anything. Like museums were just like buying any possible thing. It could be a scrap. It could be a spoon, a key, whatever they could get their hands on. So on the screen, I have a list. This is the earliest known list showing how the British curator known as Charles Reed, who was the first to see the bronzes in England. So he came up with this list as a way to like divide what he describes as the Benin Bronze plaques. So the plaques are just basically plaques that tell a story about Benin. They are basically historical documents. So there's a way of reading them. You can tell which king it represents, what ceremony it actually documents. But then let's go back to our chart and then work backwards, right? So during the invasion, after the British invaded Benin Kingdom, one thing they did in order to control Benin, they had to depose the king and exile the king. So the king was gone. And alongside with that, they destroyed the palace where he would typically store these raw materials that he imported. And so for a while, let's say, the trade with the Portuguese was kind of disrupted. At least we'll say there was a transition period, right? And so that importation as well was gone, as well as the king's ability to commission new works. And alongside with that, everything else that ideally bronze casters would make would disappear too. So there's that transition period, right? And that would also disrupt the bronze casting tradition. And so we're left with the bronze casters during this 17-year period when there was no king. And so the first thing I did when I observed this gap was go to an archive, any archive I could find that had historical documents about Benin, particularly of the colonial era, to find, okay, so what objects did bronze casters make during this period? If prior to the British invasion, if in pre-colonial times, bronze making was predicated on permission from the king, and even obtaining the material itself was predicated on permissions from the king as a bronze caster. If I lived during that time, how would I transition from this hereditary tradition to something somewhat of an open market, even though it was colonially exploited, right? Because we know that the traditions that would follow after was very much catered towards the tourist market. And so that was an important question for me, the 17-year era between 1897 and 1914. So we talked about minimal to no art production during that period. And so these are the questions I was looking at. What objects did artists create during that period? What materials could they possibly have used if, there was this cessation of trade with the Portuguese? What material would I use if I was an artist who existed during that period? Perhaps I would use, materials that were native to the land or something else. And so the big question was, how might AI help us visualize both, right? How might AI help us visualize these objects? How might AI help us think through these materials and how those materials will take form? So I started, just a little bit about generative AI. I think Jane did a great job explaining the technical aspects. My work is more historically rooted, so I will just go over it quickly. 2 methods I use. My earliest works were with StyleGAN, which Jane already explained. And then recently, like everyone, I started using text-to-image algorithm. And the reason why I'm very interested, like everyone else, in text-to-image algorithm, especially for my project, is that I'm able to produce high-fidelity images, whereas with StyleGAN, it's very much abstracted. Except you have thousands and millions of photos, you don't get the kind of fidelity that you would typically get from a text-to-image algorithm, such as, say, Stable Diffusion. And so I use my training data is primarily objects that were stolen. So I would go to a museum's website and download the objects that they have on their website and train my models. I was very interested particularly in working with a data set of looted objects and not necessarily anything that was created post the invasion, but prior to the invasion. So this would be from the British Museum. I love their images because they're very high resolution. And they have really great angles, which is good when you're training a model because you want to see your images or you want to see your objects in different perspectives. And so they have different perspectives: back view, side view, front view. And so these are some of the images from my recent model. It's called Igún, the prototype, the 7th prototype, and it's a model that I trained specifically for the show at BCA. So let's go over, I talked about the data set from the British Museum, and these are included in this data set that I used to train the model for BCA are my earlier prototypes. So on the right side, you can see the ones generated using StyleGAN, and as I mentioned, it's more abstracted, so you can tell it's kind of a head, but it's not a head. It's just sitting somewhere between uncanny and it's not realistic, and you can't really make sense of it. But you can tell a story about it, right? And so sometimes I like to tell stories, or I just like let the viewers figure it out, like work with it. But for BCA, these are my first like photorealistic works because I used stable diffusion. I fine-tuned stable diffusion using a data set of terracotta objects. And as I mentioned, if we go back to the earlier questions I started with, what materials could artists have worked with during that 17-year period? And I was very interested in a material that was native to the land, one being clay. Benin is, just the whole city of Benin is populated by clay. If you wear white fabric, and my people love to wear white fabric, your clothes just like get colored by red clay. So this was one thing I was exploring. How could we use clay to make Benin Bronzes instead of bronze as a material? Another version of an object I generated using the custom model. Another variation. They kind of look like the originals, but they are not. And another thing I need to mention is that, because sometimes folks will try to draw conclusions about what it could be used, how it could be used in our culture, but these objects have not gone through this process of ritualization, right? Typically, when you're making a Benin bronze for the bronze casters, the king would participate in pre-production and post-production rituals that sort of give legitimacy and cultural legitimacy to these objects in the corpus. But my objects are very much about exploration, so it's not culturally relevant to my people, right? They wouldn't appreciate this as they would a bronze. Of course, they kind of understand what I'm doing, but it's not a Benin bronze. And so this is another variation, and one thing I love about working with text-to-image models is now I can play with ratios. And one thing I find interesting about ratios, I work mostly with landscape ratios because it allows the model to explore more space and therefore it becomes more experimental. Whereas if you're working with portraits and squares, it just like constricts the model and there's no room for it to like play around. So I love playing around and then I can outpaint or inpaint or whatever. But I love working with ratios, and for this, it's interesting to see how it just like attaches a face to something, and I think it looks like an owl, which is weird, but. And so this is another version, side view using landscape ratio, another version which is very much minimal. Here we can see that it sort of erases the nose. There's a nose, there's no nose, it's uncanny, and it's weird. It's like cement and clay slip poured on cement. I can't really tell what it's doing, but I think it's an interesting image. And if I did want to, say, create this as a physical sculpture, I might just, use 2 different materials. This is another version. It looks more like a vessel or something you would pour maybe a drink in it. I'm not sure what it tried to do here, but it was an interesting image that I thought I should highlight. And this is a side view, so. Yes, thank you, and that's it.
be higher. Being tall, I don't fit into standard sizes. Hello everyone, I am Lapo Frati. I'm an Italian computer scientist and I'm studying a neurobotics lab here at UVM, doing my PhD with neural networks related things. And I would like to take you on a quick journey on the making of this piece, Cyberloops, that I made for the BCA exposition, and it's currently there. So if you wanna go there and play, please do so. I'm gonna show you like how it came to be and what are the ideas behind it. I tried my best to make it as visual as possible, so there shouldn't be any background required beyond like circles and potatoes maybe. If you are familiar with these two concepts, you're gonna be capable of following without any issues. And Jane and Minne have shown how to use like a generative AI. Instead, I'm gonna talk about how to use AI in a generative piece. And I hope that by the end of this, you're gonna be able to understand what it is that makes these Cyberloops fun to play with. So you're gonna start with circles, and more circles. Circles by themselves, not probably the most fun entities out there, but as anyone that has played it like with a spirograph, as soon as you touch like a pair of them together, they suddenly start making like much more interesting shapes. In this case, there are like two of them. One is on the edge of the other one, so they circle together. And if you make them such that they complete like a full circle at the same time, they create this like nice little closed curve. As you start adding more and more of these circles, the shapes that you can achieve become more and more intricate, and with the number going up and even higher up, you can start making like quite convoluted doodles, which I already find like quite fun to look at personally. You could ask maybe, okay, but what can I actually draw? Like how powerful are these seemingly harmless little circles? Well, it turns out that people that are into math have come up with like algorithms that allow you to basically draw whatever shape like you're interested in generating, and then given enough of these little circles, you can regenerate them. Now, we are not going to be on the side of you have an image and here are the circles. Circles are going to be center stage, so we are going to have direct control on these little circles, and we're going to see what kind of images we can generate. So let's start like drawing a little bit. This might look like a bit of a mess, but what we're going to do is that we're going to start like moving the circle, and we are going to collect like a bunch of points. So every different like size of the circle and rate at which the circle is going to generate different drawings, and sometimes very convoluted, and they're going to all end up where they started creating like this closed loop little nice thing. And in order for us to appreciate them without the cumbersome drawing on top of them, I'm going to collect all those like little circles that compose them and the bottom, which kind of create like a sort of a fingerprint, like a little alien clock with way too many things moving in different directions. And so what I want you to understand is that later on I'm going to show like some closed loops, which means that like I'm going through an entire loop of these things and then just putting all those points together into like a single line. And we are also going to mention like some concept that Jane has alluded to about like interpolation, and it's going to be clear in a second like what that means. Let's take. I don't know why this slide wants to be highlighted, but I'm going to deal with it for now. As I was saying, I can take all those points and put them together into like a single closed loop. You can see the little like fingerprint at the bottom, and I have this little dot moving along. You're going to see the little dot moving along soon, so keep that in mind. And different set of this like sort of alien fingerprint represents different shapes, which then we're gonna animate for a bit of extra visual flair. So in this case, sorry, I don't know why these slides want to be highlighted. What I was saying is that we can now take one of those fingerprints that you can see, for example, on the left, and then slowly change it towards a different one that you can see on the right. And the shape that you see in the middle is like an interpolation between those two states, which creates this sort of feeling of moving like from one shape to the other. And this is going to be like the centerpiece of our little animation. This is the concept very similar to the latent space interpolation that Jane was mentioning. In this case, I'm taking these set of like circles as the representation of this specific shape on the left, and I'm slowly changing it into the one on the right, and you can see that the shape changes accordingly. So that allows us to basically just automate this process and just let it go for how long we want, and creates this like constantly morphing little shape, which I personally find like very soothing to look at because of how it morphs. It creates a bit of like an illusion of like 3D-ness into it. So I spend way too much time just sitting in this thing and staring it. But it was an enjoyable experience. So now that we have this little loop that has its own like resting state, it would be nice to have a way of like interacting with it, and that's where like the AI bit is gonna sort of come into play. What we're gonna do is that we're gonna use our hands, like my hands in this case, to basically control like the alien fingerprint. In this case, I am recording like the joints angles that are like highlighted in red, which means that like whenever I move my finger, I am like generating different values for this like little like spiky monster at the center. Then I'm gonna turn this into like the actual loop, and you can see that like as I change my finger positions, like things spins in different directions. And these are the same circles that I had at the beginning explaining, like showing how like the full shape is generated. So putting these pieces together, we get this like nice little loop that I can like play with based on like the shape of my hands, which you can see also like the little dot moving along, which reminds you like that there is like a constant drawing going on of which you only see the end piece. In this case, the AI component is allowing me to just like sit back and use my hands in order to control this instead of using like a keyboard on a mouse. And I would like to help you understand how it's possible like to have in this day and age like an AI that in this case it's just running in the browser. And in order to help the understanding of that, I think I'm gonna talk about peeling potatoes, which is not necessarily what you think first when you think about like AI. But it turns out that like running code is a lot like peeling a potato. You just have a beautiful, juicy potato, and you want to remove the skin or keep it. I'm not judging. And sometimes you find a chef that can do that, like in no time at all. This guy, no problem peeling potatoes. And the guy is a bit like the CPU in your computer, very fast, very effective at what it does. But sometimes you truly have a lot of potatoes. And in that case, as good of a chef as you might be, you need some extra help. So you might get more chefs to help you. Maybe they're not as good as you are, but there's a lot of them. And that's a lot like having a GPU, which allows you to do a lot of this potato peeling in parallel. Sometimes you need a lot of chefs. Sometimes you need an entire like platoon of like army-trained chefs that like just come in and help you. And that's a lot, like having like a truly large GPU. And I think that here you can see already like why you might not always want to ask like a regiment of like army chefs to come make like a sandwich for you, because that would be a bit of a waste. But if you have to make like 1 million of them, you definitely want their help. So where can you find a lot of these potatoes to peel? Well, it turns out that the screen of your computer has a lot of digital potatoes that you might want to work on. Every pixel needs some computation to tell them what color they should be. And so it turns out that usually computers have GPUs that help them do this. And having a GPU is something that's very convenient because it turns out that you can run these shader programs, which is, as we've mentioned, a type of program, which is a bit like the instructions you might give to chefs in a kitchen. Each one of those chefs just fetches the ingredient and starts cooking all in parallel, and at the end you get some kind of delicious dish, or in the case of a shader in your computer, you get something to show on the screen. But wait, can I use the shader for more than just images? Well, it turns out that yes, you can do. And neural networks are a very good fit for GPUs, because in the same way that your screen had a bunch of potatoes to peel, that can all be done in parallel. So if you have a lot of chefs to help you, you can do that very fast. A neural network is just a bunch of neurons just do their own little operations in parallel. So if you can do a lot of them in parallel, you're gonna have a great time. And you might ask, where am I gonna find these magical shaders that you talk of? Luckily, there are a lot of resources online. The one I've used personally for this work comes from MediaPipe, which is an open source project that Google has put out there. I really don't know why some of the slides want to be highlighted, but bear with me. In this case, you have a bunch of different programs that can allow you to use AI in a very plug and play kind of fashion. Hand detection is the specific usage that I've picked for this experiment, for this work. And that allows you to have access to this hand tracking, which on a reasonably fast computer can be very effective and can allow you to interact with whatever digital piece you have in a very natural and intuitive manner. Let's see if I can go back to where I was. What was that? Oh, hey Chris, I kind of got lost on your computer. Can you bring me back on track? Computer scientist myself, cannot find it. So while we try to find our way back to the beautiful presentation I've made, I'm going to show you in a second, hopefully, how we can use this not only for the AI component that I've just highlighted to you, but also how we can write ourselves a little program that can take advantage of that. In particular, because I've shown you already some visual stuff that use the framework called P5. For those that know what it does, it's a very great little it's a very fun creative coding framework in JavaScript that you can use in the browser. But sometimes you don't want to just draw a line or a circle like I've done before. Sometimes you want to add a bit more flair to your experiments. So in this case, and you're going to see this in the piece that I show you at the end of this, what I'm doing is as I move my mouse, I'm drawing these particles. So this is in the P5 land. I can drawing little dots without any issue. But then I would like to add a bit more of a flair to them. So I would like them to have this sort of cool effect. The problem with this is that now I have a bunch of pixels that need to know what should there be, their brightness. And they have to look how clustered these things together, and based on how densely they are together, they have to be brighter. Which means that in a computer like this that has a lot of pixels to go through, you might need the help of a different kind of program, like for example a shader. The last bit that I want to show, but before putting it all together, since we had some issues coming back to this slide, I think I'm just going to mention this thing that I saved for the end, but I think it's going to be better presented now. I wanted to have in the final piece that I'm going to show in a second, like something that represents like the networks that make like the neural networks. But showing a neural network isn't very fun. There's way too many lines. So I thought about like using some kind of like little generative creative coding like approach. In this case, I've made like this little network that constantly moves. But there's a bit of like a bit of trickery here, because you might think, oh, cool, there's all these particles going around, and when they come together, like you see the line becoming like a bit thicker. But if you focus like on any one of them, you're gonna notice that they're not really like going that far from home. They're kind of just moving all in the same place. And it turns out that there's like a very famous kind of generative noise called like Worley noise. And if I reveal like what is the trickery behind like the movement of this particle, I think you're gonna be able to appreciate like the fact that they aren't really going anywhere. So in this case, I'm just drawing like their trajectories. And as you might see, notice they just remain confined in this little square grid. So if you look at this version, you might think, oh, well, look how far away they're moving. But actually, they're just following this, for me, aesthetically pleasing set of lines that creates this like grid of little loops. I think now we have like the full set of skills to appreciate like the piece in its entirety. If I can find my mouse to click, there we go. And so we can finally put it all together and create these cyber loops, which have like both flare, they have the hand detection, and they have like the little representation of the networks going in the background. So if anyone wants to play with this, you can do it technically because this can run on your computer. But if you want to do it in person, you can just visit the BCA exhibition, where there's going to be a nice 55 inches screen that is going to allow you like to play with it at your own pace. And this is what I have. I'm really happy to have been able like to generate this with the technologies, and hopefully I have shared like a bit more of the insights of how these things work behind the scene. And now I guess we're gonna go into question time. So if anyone has any questions or would like to talk about this further, like please ask or look for me. Thank you.
And I can move the microphone around, right? Questions? There's a lot of people here, so I have to. So, in the back. Okay, thank you. Wait, I'm gonna have you wait so we can hear.
Okay. I have a question for the most recent speaker. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. I missed the beginning.
Lapo.
Lapo. Okay. Would this kind of like program AI be able to create like an alphabet, like its own original sort of design alphabet language kind of thing?
Yeah, theoretically you could, given enough circles, like create any shapes that you want. In this case, I kept it like with a relatively low amount for more abstract kind of representations. But you could take the shape, like whatever font you like, trace the outline, and then use it to see like the default state. Then in this case, it's just random, but it could be set to whatever you enjoy. That would be a very interesting extension.
Thank you. Great presentations, all the artists. So a question to all the artists. What functionality do you wish that the tools had that they don't have today?
Me personally, I feel like maybe a better integration between the different parts, because it is still like you have to cross very different kind of boundaries in order to make them speak to one another. For example, the shaders use one language, P5 uses another language, and then the media pipe uses another language. So sometimes when something goes wrong, it's a bit of a pain to find out exactly where the problem is, who is responsible for it.
For me, I would say, I mentioned earlier counting. I think that we're starting to get there, and we're seeing applications of AI for counting, particularly in cellular biology, because they use AI now to like count things in a petri dish. But I last summer created a tarot deck using text-to-image generators, and had to find some creative solutions for, you know, the 8 of Wands. The text-to-image doesn't really understand counting 8 things. So in my day job, not as an artist, I'm a data visualization practitioner, and counting is very important for, you know, generating charts and things like that. So I'm working actually with some folks right now on how do we you know, create visualizations that employ counting using generative models. And there was actually a paper that recently came out like a week ago called Viz to Viz that made some interesting headway there.
For me, I think it's, and I think Midjourney already came up with this, where you can provide an image and it describes the image, then you can now adopt that description for your own text prompt. So that's one thing I wish they had, and it's already in existence.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes, great presentations, all of you. I'm inquiring about the bronzes, the Benin Bronzes, and is there a process for repatriating those to the, and where would they go if they were?
I think some museums have started repatriating them. So last year, at least, I want to say 30 of them were repatriated back to Nigeria from Germany. And I know that the Fleming Museum in UVM has taken theirs down. I don't know if it's back on view, but when I was here about a year ago, it was taken down, and I'm hoping that these conversations are happening about how to repatriate them. But back in Nigeria, they are going back to the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, which is responsible for most of the museums in Nigeria, basically public institutions, most of them. So yeah, the Nigerian government is taking charge of them, not necessarily the King of Benin right now, because he doesn't have a museum to host these objects. There are 3,000 of them.
Other questions? Yes.
Just sort of a general age-old question for all the speakers, if you choose to answer. Where do you draw the line between art and craft in what you're doing? I see potential for both in different places. There's an awful lot of craft. There's some art. How do you figure out where the line is between those things?
I personally follow the compass of fun, and I try to just enjoy the process and create something which is aesthetically pleasing, or at least for me, fun to like tweak, interact, look at. So I feel like the line, I don't draw it because it's very blurry, it changes constantly, it moves. Sometimes I feel like, oh yeah, this is just me going back to neural networks and how they work. Other times it's just me in P5, just having fun, putting together shapes and colors.
Yeah, I also find it a little bit challenging to think about those two things as separate. I think more I think about, and you'll actually see this after the lunch break, I'm giving a workshop on how to actually make these things. And so I think, you know, the talk that I just gave, I would consider an artist talk, but maybe the workshop is more of a craftsmanship talk, in that there are discussions to be had both, you know, in terms of like, artistic vision or narrative, and then there are conversations to be had about the actual construction and the prototyping and the things that go wrong and sort of process. And so I guess maybe that's how I might separate art and craft, is more like process versus product, but I think that they're both important conversations to have.
I think I like to leave my viewers to kind of make that decision for themselves, because my works are more experimental in nature and it touches on culture. So for some folks who see my pieces, it's more like a Benin Bronze, and for others who are more artistically inclined, they kind of pay attention to the craft. And for AI engineers, they're looking at the kind of methods and techniques I'm working with, and I just like to leave it at that.
Right, time for one or two more questions. All right, let me make sure I saw everyone. Well, great. Help me thank all of our wonderful artists again.